Well, friends, it is time for another episode of Brush Hour, the bi-weekly show where we talk about, surprisingly, brushes. I'm Kyle T. Webster, your host. Thank you for joining me. We are here today on a fine Wednesday to look at pattern brushes. So we're talking about custom brushes that you make that could generate some kind of a pattern. There are so many uses for these, and I'm excited for you all to see what they are. Before we go any further, I want to make sure that you can hear me. Had some issues with microphones last week. I replaced my microphone and things seem to be checking out on my end, but give me a thumbs up and give me a little note in the chat to let me know if everything is okay before we get rolling. Speaking of the chat, I want to say hi to some folks who are joining us. Now remember, if you're watching over on YouTube or on Twitter, I am not following the chat over there. I am following the chat over on Behance, and that is be.net/Adobe Live. Okay, so if you are a fan of Bill Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that's how you remember it. be.net/Adobe Live, and that's where we are today for a little bit of Photoshop brush action. Now, the brushes that I'm going to be creating today will work perfectly well and beautifully, just as expected, in Adobe Fresco as well. And I'd like to make a really special announcement today because I've announced this other places, but I want to make sure I get the word out. Adobe Fresco, which is a focused illustration app that I have helped to build, and I'm really proud of being on that team, is now in its third year, and we update it every 6 to 8 weeks. And one of the things that the customers, that's you, asked was, could you please lower the cost of Adobe Fresco? And folks, I'm so pleased to say that not only did we lower it, but we lowered it so significantly that if you want to have a premium subscription to Adobe Fresco now, it is only $9.99 per year. Per year. So if you want, you could go get a couple of coffees, or you could get a subscription to Fresco for a year. Up to you. That includes the 2,000 brushes in the brush library that I have created for Adobe. It includes 5 gigs of cloud storage. It includes access to the 20,000 Adobe fonts and so much more. So yeah, just want to make that announcement. But if you don't want to spend that $10 a year, that's fine too. Fresco is also a free app, so you just grab it for free. So there's my plug for today. I'll stop being Mr. Advertising guy, but I wanted to make that known because it's amazing news and I'm really excited about it. All right, folks, let's get to it. We're going to do some drawing and we're going to do some brush making. Here we go. Now, pattern brushes. What are we talking about here? All right. If you want to see some examples of pattern brushes that I have created in the past, you can check out the lettering brush set. In the lettering brush set, I created a few border brushes, like decorative borders. But that's really about it. Now, I mean, there are other examples of pattern brushes that I've created that aren't really exactly what we're talking about today, such as the halftone brushes, because after all, those are patterns. But those are actually taking advantage of a texture, a single image that has a repeating pattern. What we're talking about today is brushes that use a stamp, a custom stamp that you design, and then you use the brush settings panel to manipulate that stamp to draw patterns, okay? So not quite the same thing. So why don't we just start making one, and we're going to start simple, and then we're going to go more complex as we go along, all right? So I'm just going to grab this Doozy Inker and do some drawing. Now the Doozy Inker is a brush you can get for free over on my Gumroad page, and it is the brush that I used to use for my draw along show, which some of you may remember. A lot of people asked me about that brush, so I wanted to just make it available for everyone out there in the world to draw with. So here it is. Now, a pattern brush. Well, to keep things simple, let's start with this. Just going to create a little circle, okay? And right next to it, I'm just going to put a little open triangle like that. All right, put that a little closer actually, like this. There we go. All right, Nothing too exciting. Now, to make Photoshop brushes, how do you do it? It's very simple, folks. Edit, right up here at the top. Define brush preset. See that? All right. Call it whatever you want. We'll do a little circle try. There we go. And right here at the bottom of my brush list, that new brush appears, okay? It has been born, and it has been born with no features other than a stamp. So this is where our brush settings panel comes in. Now remember, if you cannot see your brush settings panel, this is what you need to do. Come up to the window right here and ensure that brush settings is visible. Okay, gang? That's important. I'll tell you what else is important. Hydration. Yes, indeed. Okay. Now, we have this stamp that I'm going to drag around. And it is not creating a pattern. This is not what I want. This is not what I want. So instead, okay, make a new layer here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first, where it says brush tip shape, right here at the top, our first set of options that we can control. The bottom here where it says spacing, just going to increase the spacing, okay? And now we're getting somewhere. See? This is getting to where what I want. Something where when I draw with it, I'm going to get a little pattern, okay? So I increase the spacing. And next, under shape dynamics, I'm going to open that up. And here where it says angle jitter, okay? Now ignore the jitter part for now because that's not what we're controlling. We're just talking about angle here. There is a way to control the angle of that brush stamp that you've created, okay? This image that's floating over the screen right now. One of which is direction. Now with direction, if I move downward, okay, my brush stamp will rotate 90 degrees and follow the stylus. If I move upwards, it will rotate 90 degrees counterclockwise and follow it. So essentially what's happening is whichever direction you move the stylus, the brush stamp will orient itself so that it is following directly behind at that angle. So now if I do this, see, or do this, or do this, you can see that it's following now the direction that I move the stylus. Now this is very handy for a brush that is going to generate pattern, because if I want to do something like this, right, where it's moving in little rainbow shapes, okay, I can consistently draw the pattern facing in the right direction, right? And that's very nice. Then I can do this and continue to draw with the brush like that. All right, so we are now creating a very simple pattern brush. Very nice. All right. But there are more things we can do as well with shape dynamics. What if we want to control the size of the brush with the pressure of the stylus we're using? Tap on pen pressure. And here I can control the minimum size, which would be if I'm using very light pressure. All right, and if I made it just 50%, then whatever the size of the stamp is originally, and you can always check that by looking over here, okay, where you can see all my tool settings here for the brush tool. 81 pixels is currently the value. You can also tap on brush tip shape, and you'll find that information right here, okay? Now, since I've set it to 50, if I use lighter pressure, it's going to be smaller, and then heavier pressure, and then back to lighter pressure. It'll never get smaller than 50% of the original size. Coming back here, if I pull it on down to 0, that means I can go so small that it's essentially drawing at about the size of 1 pixel, if you will. Okay? And there you go. Now, there might be reasons that this could be useful. All right, so just know that it's there. Okay, now, a brush like this that's so simple and so basic, do you think that it is useful? Well, that's up to you. Okay, there are so many ways to use pattern brushes, and a lot of the times what I do is I actually design pattern brushes for a very specific need. So if I know that I have an element of an illustration that is going to be repetitive, or that's going to require a certain kind of a design that I don't want to draw, especially if it's kind of busy, then I'll create a pattern brush for it that I can reuse for something like that, and that can be really helpful. Imagine that, for example, you're going to draw some kind of a lace pattern, all right? So let's say I'm designing a dress for a character, or maybe there's some kind of a lacy pattern in some wallpaper, and I want to draw that. Well, I would draw it one time as a pattern brush, and then I would be able to use that in the illustration and save a lot of time. All right, but let's go from the simple now to a little bit more complex, okay? So I'll go back to my brushes, and in my brush history here, you'll see I can go back to that Doozy Inker right there at the top. The last 7 brushes I've used are always showing up right here at the top. All right, and now what I'm going to do is this, and I'm going to draw a line up this way and a line up that way. Okay? Now this is not perfect, this is irregular, okay? And that's fine. A lot of what I like to do with these hand-drawn patterns is make them feel hand-drawn, okay? And so things will not line up exactly the way I want, and that's fine. What I'm really looking for is let's see here, let me just do this. There we go, it's a little better. But I don't want it to be perfect. I like for things to look a little rough and tumble, okay? Hence the use of a brush like this, which has a bit of texture to it and all that good stuff. All right. Now, when you're thinking in terms of designing brushes for patterns, you want to think about that repetition element. You have to remember that the stamp is going to be sitting to the left or to the right of itself with every new instance, okay? How are these things going to align with one another, and what will the result be? So I'll start with this stamp, and I'll again come to Edit, Define, Designing the Brush. Remember what we do first. We come to Spacing, and we're going to increase that spacing. And if I go to a value of about 99%, right, what should happen is a nice little overlap like that. Let's push it a little more. There we go. And that's kind of what I'm looking for, this sort of a diamond shape in between, all right? Now, if we come back to our shape dynamics, all right, one of the nice things we can do is we can take our brush stamps and we can flip it along either the horizontal or the vertical axis. So if I flip it along the horizontal axis, flip X jitter right here, okay, the X flip it. So what that's going to do is make it even a little less perfect. It's going to be even more sort of that hand-drawn look, because occasionally it's just mirroring that shape, okay? And then what we can do is we can come in here and do a angle jitter of about 1% or so. That's going to make it a little bit more wonky. Maybe a size jitter for about 5%. And we can do a little pen pressure control here, and I'll set it to about 70%. So I can go a little smaller, a little bigger, a little smaller, a little bigger. And then I can draw these patterns like this. Okay? And that could be really interesting as a design element, as a textural element, as just something to make for example, let's say we have a little sweater, okay? And we go ahead and we fill it with a color. And then we go to another color. All right. And then we just draw this pattern across. Sometimes a little tighter, sometimes a little looser. Okay? And there you have a little interesting element for an illustration where you can quickly add a little pattern to something. Now, let's go back a minute. Still keep our active selection there. And let's introduce another element that could be interesting here, okay? And that is dual brush. So dual brush is a secondary brush stamp that will interact with your primary brush stamp in some interesting way. The way to make the dual brush stamp visible will depend on whether or not you employ a couple of other elements, and these could be transfers, such as controlling pen pressure, using pen pressure rather to control opacity and flow. Another way is to have it interact with the texture, which we have not yet assigned. So a texture file can bring out some dual brush visibility, and transfer properties such as opacity and flow can also do this. And one of the things I can do is I can come back here to my primary brush stamp and look and find it. Let's see. Here it is, okay? And what I'll do is I'll look for an element that I can recognize, like this star right here. And you'll notice that I'm about a little bit past halfway. So I'd say 60% down the entire list of brush stamps that I have saved. So this will help me remember where this is. So what I want to do is I want to use this same brush stamp as a dual brush element and start messing around with that. So I'm going to come back to dual brush and scroll down about 60% of the way, and I'm going to look for that star that I just saw a minute ago. There it is, which tells me, here's the brush I'm looking for. Now, with the dual brush, I'm going to scatter it. I'm going to make it jump off of the line I'm drawing, okay, either vertically above or below. I'm also going to increase the spacing. And as I do this, I want you to look down here, and you're going to see evidence of how that stamp is influencing, okay, the primary stamp right there. Now, in order to make that show up more, I could employ transfer. Now, as soon as I do that, you can see that that stamp is now basically erasing away a lot of the primary stamp. It's using the shape of the same stamp to just periodically erase away a lot of the primary stamp. If I come back to my dual brush settings and reduce the spacing, right, you'll see that happening less and less, right? So I could do something like this, come back to my transfer, and I'm going to increase the minimum opacity there, so it's not too strong an effect. I'm also going to add pen pressure to control flow. And what this is going to do is, as I draw, okay, you'll see that no longer is the line 100% opaque, okay? But also, the stamp is getting broken apart randomly all throughout the stroke, okay, with its own shape, because I selected that as my dual brush shape. And just so you're clear, the mode that I'm using for this is color burn. I like that one because it's a subtractive sort of an action. Now the issue here is that I'm not drawing with full opacity. I would like to draw with full opacity and still get these effects. In order to achieve that, one of the things I've discovered that works is employing a texture. So if I come in here to texture, I'll just grab something very simple. I have some very simple grayscale textures here. Grainy new, there we go. All right, so I've noticed that if I employ a texture with the height mode right here, okay, and then use light pressure, I can still get that broken apart look, but I can get a little bit more opacity. Now you can see that some of it is still not fully opaque, okay? But I can control that with the height settings here. I can control that with my transfer settings. And what I like to do is just experiment and go back and forth between changing the flow settings of the brush, between changing the transfer settings of the brush, the texture settings of the brush, and all these other things to get a result that looks really natural and really fun. All right. But you can see how far along we've come now with the design of this brush, where it's doing all kinds of lovely things. All right, and this pattern is quite interesting. But let's take it another step further. Let's take it another step further. Okay, here we go. Color dynamics. Now, you've heard me talk about color dynamics, I'm sure, many times, but it bears repeating that they are really amazing and there's so much you can do with them. I'd like to change the hue a little bit and the brightness a little bit, all right? And let's pick a brighter color. I'm gonna come back to my, no, this will be fine, this will be fine. All right, so here we go. I'm going to use this sweater as a selection by holding down the Command key and then tapping on the layer thumbnail for the sweater, just like that. That will make a selection from the layer contents. If you're working on a PC, you could hold down the Control key and do the same thing. Now, because we're employing color dynamics now, what's going to happen is whatever color I've selected as my foreground color, as I start to draw with it, it's going to change the hue and the brightness of that color with every instance of the stamp with this pattern brush, and really create something kind of interesting here, like that. And as we zoom in, as I continue to play and throw that in there, like that. Then I could come over with a darker color and more layering and make that a pretty interesting result. Okay, there you go. Hit the shape. You think about how you want it to repeat, and so then you control the spacing of the stamp, right? You start with the spacing. Then you decide whether or not you want it to be influenced by the pressure of the pen for the size, and whether or not you want to have the shape itself change a little bit. So I employed a little bit of jitter for the size. And then we decided to use a dual brush with a color burn mode so that it would remove a gray image with a noise grain on it. That's all it is. That's all it is. So it's just a bit of noise. And then we finally threw a little bit of color dynamics on top. And the result. So what if you want something more complex? And I'm sure many of you would like that. Well then, of course, you have to design it. You have to think about the repetition of it and how it's going to align and so on. So let's get to that. So I'll go ahead and group these and give them their own little spot there. Now, one of the things I do is when I create these, I keep them on their own layer so that when I'm designing brushes, I can always come back to a stamp and I can edit it in some way. So since we're already working with this, let's come back. And I'm going to just jump right back up to the top to that Doozy Inker again. And here on this same layer where we were working on this stamp, I'm just going to add a little circle there and a little circle there. Okay. And then let's do this. Actually, you know what? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make this shape like this. I'm going to make this into kind of like the, sort of like a pictogram, is that the word? Or some kind of ancient symbol or something like that. Okay. So it's fun to take something I've already drawn and then add something to it and see how that's going to feel. Okay, and I could get a little bit fancier. I could do this and this, like that. Maybe add a little something there, make that just carry on. That's kind of fun. And just see what happens, right? You don't know. Define brush preset. Not even gonna bother naming it. I just come down, there it is. And let's go to our brush tip shape. Let's increase the spacing a little bit. There we go. And then remember, we turn on our direction control. Okay. And let's just see what that looks like. That's pretty cool. That's pretty interesting. There you go. Now remember last time what we did was flip the X jitter. So what that's going to do is, because I have an element that is not symmetrical, if you remember that I've drawn with this stamp a little section right here that's got its own thing going on. Okay, it's not mirrored on this side. So if that winds up switching places across the x-axis, okay, then occasionally what I'll get is what you see happening here, where that bar continues all the way across, but sometimes it's broken. So that could be interesting for a little irregularity if you're looking for that. Okay. Folks, I had a power outage. I'm still trying to get back online. I'm just going to keep going with the show and hope that it's actually broadcasting. But it's hard for me to know right now. Well, let's see what happens. Okay. We were in the middle of making pattern brushes. I had just gone ahead and made this little guy right here. So let's continue with that. There we go. Power to the entire house went out and then it came back on, so I don't know what's going on, but I'm in the dark here. Okay, so we took something simple, we made it a little more complex, and now we're playing around with that. All right, now another thing we haven't played around with yet is flipping the X and Y jitter together. Okay, so if I do this, it's going to flip that pattern, as you can see right here. And I'll turn off this control right now. All right. And as I draw from right to left, you'll see that occasionally it's going to reverse the image, okay, vertically. See how it's flipping it like that? Now this could be interesting for you, and if you want to do something like that, you have to think about beforehand, okay, how am I going to design the pattern so that if I take advantage of that, it makes sense, right? So let's go ahead and go back to a brush that I can draw with. And we'll do this. Oops, there we go. Make a little diamond shape. Now I know that a diamond, if I flip it vertically, is going to be basically the same, okay? And that's interesting and fine. Nothing exciting there. But what I can do is this, right? Now, when I bisect the diamond at an angle like this, if I were to take this shape, let's duplicate it really fast. I'll drag it over here. Okay, this is a good way to test this. And then flip it vertically, okay? I can see what will happen if those two shapes are together, okay? And then I get that mirroring thing happening right there. But the mirroring that's happening horizontally, right? I haven't actually assigned that yet, but you can see that just by flipping vertically, I'm going to imitate this effect of mirroring horizontally because of that diagonal line, all right? Another nice thing about this is I can sort of check myself. So we'll turn that off for my alignment and make sure everything looks pretty good. All right, so that's going to be a start for me right there. Now I'm going to think about things that could flip and alternate. All right, so maybe just a little dot right there. okay? Go to Edit, Define Brush Preset. There we go. And we come down to our brush list here at the bottom. There it is. You guys know what to do, right? Come to Brush Tip Shape. Go ahead and drag that out. And this time, look what I could do. I could even align them like this. That'd be kind of interesting. It's fun to play with spacing and see what you want to do. But for now, I'm just going to keep them pretty much at a distance of about 95 or so. We'll go to Shape Dynamics and turn on Direction, and we'll get a better sense of how that's going to look. All right. Now I'm going to flip that Y jitter. And I'm going to flip the X jitter. Okay. And when I draw with it, those dots wind up being the thing that you really notice kind of randomly jumping around there. But it still feels like a pattern. Now if this happens right here, right, and I don't like it, I know what to do. Come back to the brush settings, and what I'm not going to do is flip that X, okay? That way, no matter what I do, there's always going to be space between those dots, but I'm still going to get that random flip where that diagonal line in the middle switches, right? From lower left to upper right to lower right to upper left, all right? Now remember, I've got my original stamp here, and I can always come in and I can start editing that some more. So let's see. I'm going to do this so it'll join up with itself. Okay? Make more of sort of a chain like that. And then I'll add a nice little line right here and right there. We go Edit, Define Brush Preset, come back, go to our brush settings, increase that spacing a little bit. There we go. And we're going to make sure that it follows the direction of our brush. And then we can do this. So now you get into this idea of linking patterns, okay? So this pattern will link because it has those little bits that are extending, right, off the sides. If you want them to line up better, what you do is you come back to your stamp design right here. And there are lots of ways to do this, but the easiest thing you can do is to simply give yourself a little guideline or something like this, where you can check and see how they're aligned, right? And that's really a handy thing, because I can take this and I can scoot it down here like this and see, does that line up pretty nicely? Yeah, it does. Turn off my guides. That's Command : okay? Good to know these keyboard shortcuts, gang. Command : make that a little longer. Now those line up nicely. There we go. And we go to Edit, Define Brush Preset, kablamo. And then we go to our settings, increase the spacing again. So there's a little overlap there. And then set it to direction. Okay? And that's a little tighter. Turn on some pen pressure to control the size if you want. Like this. And so far so good. Everything's really consistent. Now I can flip that Y jitter. And you can see now that I'm going to get occasionally that little flipperoo of those diagonal lines through the center. I can also tighten up the spacing even a bit more. And wind up with something like that. So what does this mean for your design work, for the stuff that you want to create? Well, like I said earlier, specific use cases will come up where you want to do something that requires a pattern. Now the example everybody's familiar with, and I always like to show it because, well, it's easy to demonstrate, is a chain link, okay? So you can imagine that you go ahead and you have a chain, sort of a linking shape, and you know, there you go. And you just say edit, define brush preset, and you know the drill. Come over here, adjust your spacing, right? So that link's going to be in the middle. And then you can go ahead and do your pen pressure control and turn on direction. And now you've got linking chains. Okay, so we've probably all seen this example before. But you can imagine doing this for things that are more decorative, okay? So why don't we do that? Come back and draw myself a line, all right? And then on that line, draw a leaf, and then a smaller leaf, okay? And then we start to get a little fancy schmancy here, okay? Do a little bit of that. Maybe a little curly Q kind of a thing right there. Edit, define brush preset. Now we come here, increase our spacing a little bit. Okay. And we make sure that this is going to follow the direction of our stylus. And there we go. Now we've got this fancy little pattern. Okay, so you can imagine this being useful for a little decorative kind of a border, maybe some kind of architectural element or some kind of a room that you're designing or whatever it happens to be, okay? And to keep things interesting, you could always flip the Y jitter in this case. And what it's going to do is make it so that those flip. But one thing you'll notice is a problem. The lines no longer align with each other through the center, okay? So this is very easy to solve, and I'll show you how you do it. Come back to your original. All right, and what you do is you look at the total height. Sorry, there we go. You look at the total height of your design right here. Okay, and you see that little pink line that is suddenly showing up? That is telling me, hey, Kyle, that is the center of your the design that you're drawing, the vertical center there. What I need is I need for this line to appear in the center if I want this to work. But what I like about this is that it's not symmetrical, okay? So how do I get around that? Well, here's what I do. Everybody's different, but this is my little solution for this, okay? So I'll find the center by drawing basically from the center of the line itself. Okay, I make a little selection like this. From the center of the line itself, I make myself a little rectangular marquee selection, okay? Now that I've found that, I take it and I slide it on down like this. And I say, cool, I know that I need to add something down here to make this work. And this is my weird little solution. I make a new layer, okay? And I go ahead and I grab any brush, doesn't matter. And I make a new layer and I just draw a little dot down here somewhere like this, okay? And then I come on down and I zoom into the pixel sort of view where basically everything is a pixel. And this little guy is the only one remaining. Now, I know that he's sitting right on the edge of that selection at the bottom. So what I do is I take his opacity and I make it like 2%, okay? Or maybe even 1%, doesn't matter. So it's there, but you can barely see it, okay? I'll make it 2% in case you can't see it. Now the interesting thing is if I go to say edit, define, brush preset right now, Photoshop is still going to take into account any pixel that's visible. Any pixel that's visible, okay? And so what that means is now, when I make a brush, and let's do exactly the same thing as before. We're going to increase the spacing, okay? We want these to overlap a little bit. We'll go ahead and turn on that size control. And then we go to our flip Y jitter. That's what we did last time. What you'll notice this time is that as I'm drawing, the center line actually lines up, okay? So one more time, come back here. This is the original stamp I drew. Now, when I make a brush with this, define brush preset, and you know the drill, we come in here, we increase our spacing, right? And then we'll turn on direction. Everything looks fine and dandy, okay? But the moment I want to flip that Y jitter so that I can get that larger leaf sometimes to appear on the opposite side, the stem winds up being a little off. We don't want that. The solution is, again, right here. On the layer above this little guy, I have a pixel, a single pixel. You can barely see it because I have it set to 2% opacity, but I'll go ahead and increase that to 100. And there it is. See that tiny little single pixel? He's hanging out down there at the bottom. And the reason he's there is if I were to draw this rectangle from the center of the stem there down to that pixel, take that rectangle and drag it up to the other half, you'll notice that, there we go, it's going to line up with the topmost pixel of that design on the other side. So I'm forcing the brush to be designed in such a way that there is information, okay, even though it's not visible, there's information that is forcing this line to become the center of the design. Does that make sense? Everyone clear on this? Now, what I did was I reduced that to 2% opacity so you couldn't see it. And then when I go ahead and make that brush stamp, define brush preset, tucks it on down there at the bottom, okay? We go ahead and, as usual, increase the spacing to whatever we want it to be. I want that to overlap, right? Just a hair. Direction. And now when I flip that Y jitter, see what's happening? Let's go over here. Success. So what you're doing is you're cheating the system. You're telling Photoshop that there's pixel data there that you need to acknowledge in generating that brush stamp. But to us, to the viewer, you don't see any of that. So if you've ever wondered, like, well, how is it that people design foliage brushes, for example, and when they're painting and drawing with them, even though you notice that leaves are flipping from side to side and there's size jitter and all kinds of other lovely things going on, how is it possible that the stem stays in the middle? Well, that's the trick that I use. I don't know how other people do it. This was just something that I kind of stumbled on when I was experimenting and trying to figure things out. So it works well for me, so I wanted to share it with you. Let's go ahead and turn on some pen pressure for size. And look at this. I'll even adjust the roundness jitter now, okay? That means I'm taking the stamp and I'm squishing it, okay, randomly like this. And now when I draw with it, okay, this is what I'm gonna get. And this is still relatively simple. You could start getting really complex with your thinking about how to design and draw these patterns, right? But in the example that I shared on Twitter today, right here, you can see that something as simple as a triangle, right, with a couple of lines next to it as a pattern brush, is all that's required to make this very kind of simple and not very exciting illustration actually have what appears to be a style to it, right? You can basically generate a style simply by using a pattern brush to make things work. So I hope that makes sense. All right. So at the beginning, we went ahead and we played with color dynamics, we played with texture, we played with a dual brush, and these are some of the things you can do to make the pattern a little bit more exciting. But sometimes you need something to just be very precise. You can absolutely do that as well. And in those instances, what I recommend doing is using a grid, using a guide, and taking your time and thinking about how things are going to line up left to right or top to bottom. Now I've tried the design brushes like that in the past for various purposes, and they work great. But I just want to quickly show you something you could do if you are working in a way that you don't want to use the brush as a pattern, but you want to use the pattern as a pattern, or rather the texture that you apply to the brush. So I'll make a new document, and I'm going to make the document just 200 pixels square, okay? So it's going to be very small. And what I'm going to do is just go ahead, take my Doozy Inker again, and I'm just going to draw inside of here. A little square like that, okay? And then I'll go ahead and make something happen over here like this. All right, and this time I'm going to say edit define pattern, not edit define brush preset. Okay, we say okay, and let's come back to that other document, and I'll just, with this same brush, I'm going to turn off some of these other fancy bits for a second. Make it bigger. And under texture, watch this. I'm going to come all the way down and select that one we just made. Okay? And the mode I'm going to set to subtract. Now, if I turn that up to 100%, okay, you'll notice that what I can then draw is utilizing that pattern. It's basically just making that pattern show up on the screen, okay? So in this instance, I've created a pattern, and I can take the texture and I can reduce the scale of it however I want in my brush settings, and then I can draw with that pattern, and it's going to show up exactly the way I want. So this is a different exercise, it's a different way of doing it, but it's worth noting that it can be done, and it can be done very quickly. Okay, you can see how easy that was. So a combination of using textures like this and then using patterns that you make as brushes can open up some pretty interesting possibilities, and I think that's pretty exciting. All right. So there you go, folks, pattern brushes. Lots to do, lots to play with there. In the summer 2022 brushes, which are coming out soon, I'm going to have a few interesting pattern brushes for you to play with. An example of one of those is right here. It's called Aztec, and I really like this one. And now you know how it's done, so go ahead, play around, have fun, and make your own, because they're really simple to do. And again, like I said earlier, they work great in Fresco, they work great in Photoshop, they work everywhere. So thanks for joining me for Brush Hour. We'll be back again in 2 weeks. And remember, I have an illustration masterclass Friday, so please tune in for that. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, remember to be kind, and I'll say ciao for now.